Hey and welcome! For today's video I figured we should do a summer project. That's why I came up with this sheared top design. By the way, this tutorial is very beginner friendly because the pattern only consists of some rectangles and I'll give you detailed explanation. Now let's jump right into the video. First of all, as you can see in the middle, there's like our bodice, and then we have 4 sleeve options that you could choose. And this is our pattern for the bodice. If you want to, you could now take a screenshot. As you might have seen, our bodice has 2 cm seam allowance at the bottom and 5 cm seam allowance at the top. That's because we will fold it over by 1 cm at the top and at the bottom, and then we will fold it again by 1 cm at the bottom and 4 cm at the top. Then you just pin it in place, iron it, and then you sew with a normal straight stitch. And this is now how yours should at least somehow look like. Since we are shearing today, you will need a special thread, which is an elastic thread. And while you're winding it up by hand, make sure first of all not to apply too much tension, and I would also recommend to use a pencil because that just makes it much easier. And then you need to play around with tensions and length a little bit to have the perfect settings. These are my settings, so length was 3, width was 0, and tension is a bit higher, normally at 5. And as you can see, the thread at the bottom is the elastic one and the upper one is just your normal sewing thread. So now we do start with our actual shearing process. There are some little things you need to be aware of. Now our first shearing seam is going to be on that exact seam that we just made, and then we will continue. So you will always sew on the right side of the fabric, which is the beautiful side, because you don't want to see any elastic thread on your finished garment. And while you sew, you always stretch the fabric, and you could possibly draw lines, but in my case I just make sure that there's a as you can see, half of a foot in between each seam. And then you just continue shearing up until a point where you think it's enough. The shearing process is definitely what takes the longest, but it's actually very easy. Now this is the part where you could design your top. So in my case I left about 6 cm unsheared at the bottom, and at the top, as you can see, I added some seams so that I just had 2 cm left. By the way, I followed a German tutorial for the bodice, that's why I modified my top a bit. It's obviously linked down below, and also linked down below is my thread. I used 20 meters, but I would recommend to buy more in case you're making some mistakes as I did. Now we will close our bodice with a French seam, so everyone who just wants a tube top without any sleeves could just end after this step. For the French seam, we will now line up the left sides, meaning that the less beautiful sides are facing each other and the beautiful side is facing towards you. And then we will just pin it and sew along the line with a normal straight stitch. And after we did that, we are going to trim off the excess fabric as close to the seam as possible, making sure not to cut in the seam, and then we are going to turn it inside out and sew right sides facing, making sure to include the seam allowance that we just cut. And again, as we do in this whole tutorial, we will use a straight stitch for that seam. Now let's continue with the sleeves. Mine were about 62 times 47 centimeters, but I do not have a pattern here since it's your individual choice. Just make sure to add 5 centimeters seam allowance at the top and 2 centimeters seam allowance at the bottom, because the first step is the same step that we did with the bodice, meaning that we are going to fold it over once by 1 centimeters and then a second time by 1 centimeters again for the bottom, and for the top it's 1 and then 4 centimeters folded over. Here's now how it should look like, and now we're going to do the same exact thing that we also did for the bodice. So we are going to shear that seam that we just created and then just add 1 or 2, that's like your personal choice, more shearing seams. And then I also added like 2 shearing seams about 7 centimeters before the end of the sleeve, but that's also your personal choice. Maybe you want it to sit rather near your wrist or rather near your elbow, or you want it to be a bit more tight, so you could do like 3 or 4 shearing seams. That's your individual part. And here you can now see how it does look like. If you just want to have the puffy sleeve top, which you could also transform into the off-shoulder top, you can now finish off the sleeves with a French seam and then line up the bodice and the sleeves and sew them together. So in this case, this will be your last step. I will not explain it again, it's just the French seam that we did earlier on. Oh, and by the way, I also added some elastic to the top and even seam ripped the shearing seams afterwards, because they just weren't enough to hold the sleeve on my shoulder. That's why I did this, but maybe in your case you don't need this step. Okay, so now let's make the third and fourth version of the sleeves, which are the straps. Therefore you need 4 rectangles. You only need 4 rectangles in case you want to make the little bow version. If you only want to have normal straps, just use 2 of them. And again, you need to use your own measurements. In my case it was about 50 times 7, I guess. I would even recommend to do it a bit longer for the bow version, and for the width you can just do however you feel comfortable with. The next step is now to line the straps right sides facing, and then we do sew a little like L, meaning that we only sew one side closed because we are going to use the other side to turn them all inside out. In my case, I'm lucky to have this like loop turner. It's not expensive, I guess it was like 1 or 2 euros. But if you don't have one, don't worry, you could also use a safety pin. After you turned them all inside out and ironed them, you could possibly top stitch them, but that's optional. But one thing isn't optional, which is that we also need to close the ends by just folding them in and then doing a top stitch so that like the raw edges are covered. So now let's finally connect the top and the sleeves. Therefore we are going to search for the middle, like this one. I think you could see it, it's that one right here. So now we know where our sides are, and there we can attach the sleeves now. by the way, here's how our top stitched ends of the straps do look like. And now, as I said earlier on, if you only decide on one sleeve option, you could always just sew it to the top, but in my case I used these buttons here. So for example, for the bow version you could do 2 per strap, so 4 at the front and 4 at the back. And also there are other options, for example those hooks and eyes, which you could use to connect the sleeves to the top. If you want to combine the 2 strap versions, I would recommend to do the buttons anywhere here, because obviously because of the bow your straps are a bit longer, and if you want to wear them normally you need to shorten your strap by putting the buttons a bit higher. And lastly, for the sleeves I would recommend to use like 2 or 3 buttons on each side, and make sure to try the top on before you sew the buttons on. And that's it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and to subscribe to this channel to not miss out any further video. And now here comes the final reveal. Bye!